This particular tale is one that's been seared into the deepest hollows of my psyche since childhood. For you see, I spent nearly every summer of my youth out in the untamed wilderness of northern Pennsylvania, at my late grandparents' remote homestead. Now when I say remote, I'm talking gravel roads, no nearby neighbors for miles, the nearest town over an hour's drive. The kind of gloriously isolating setting that seems almost alien to us modern dwellers nowadays. My grandfather, Papa, God rest his soul, was an avid outdoorsman, and lived for taking me under his wing each summer to impart some of that mountain wisdom, teaching me wilderness survival skills, hunting, foraging, you name it. But more than anything, he cherished sharing his profound reverence for the ancient, densely forested mountains that formed the backyard view from their rustic cabin. Papa used to wax poetic about the Black Forest National Park that began quite literally across the creek from their property line. How that vast, unbroken expanse of old growth represented one of the last wild, untamed places on the eastern seaboard, a remnant domain of hoary Appalachian mysteries that mankind had yet to tame or understand. To hear him tell it, the forest possessed an awareness, even an ill intent, towards those who wandered too deep without the proper respects paid. Being a snot-nosed city kid, of course I didn't put much stock in his fanciful ramblings about the sentience of the woodlands at first. That changed though after Papa and I constructed a ramshackle childhood dream, our own personal treehouse kingdom hidden away in the emerald heart of that very black forest he constantly warned me about. I'll never forget the sense of pride and accomplishment the day we hung the finalized rope ladder and beheld our rustic aerial lair for the first time. Every summer without fail, Papa and I would make that 2-mile trek along the old loggers trail into the forest interior, climbing up into our treehouse hideaway to while away the days reading, whittling wood figurines, or just drinking in the heady scents and sights of that primordial woodland cathedral. We carved our initials into nearly every beam, leaving behind our own tiny hieroglyphs. Eventually though, I outgrew those idyllic summer pastimes after graduating high school. Got swept up in college life, then a career, then adult responsibilities, and the busybody routine we all know too well clouded out making the long pilgrimage back to that treehouse sanctuary. Papa passed on in my late 20s, and with him went most of my remaining ties to that wild mountain realm. Until this spring, that is, when I decided it was finally time to revisit those hallowed woods after 2 decades away and pay my respects one final time. I wondered if our ramshackle treehouse had withstood the elements all these years. Part of me even fantasized about moving back to that off-grid ancestral homestead for good, rekindling the magic of those carefree summers with Papa surrounded by the Black Forest's lush, living shadows. Well, after a sweaty, nostalgic 2-mile hike along that old trail, I knew like the back of my hand as a kid. I finally broke through the underbrush to behold our treehouse still standing, preserved in remarkable, almost unnatural condition despite 2 decades of harsh Pennsylvanian elements. The bark had healed over every haphazard carving and nail hole Papa and I hacked into the mighty oak's graying skin so many years ago, our faded initials barely visible as if the forest was slowly subsuming them. And at first glance, everything seemed more or less how we'd left it behind. That rope ladder still hanging invitingly, the platform built from scavenged lumber appearing as sturdy as the day we'd christened it, and spilled our bloods as slivers slicing our palms. For just an instant, I felt like an awestruck 10-year-old again, drunk on the evergreen aromas of rebirth wafting up from the lingering snowmelt below. My reverie was short-lived, however, as I began to notice discrepancies up there. Things out of place that rustled the breath in my very lungs. Some of the treehouse floor planks looked newly sanded down. Certain handholds on the ladder were freshly whittled into more ergonomic shapes, as if someone or something had been continuing its maintenance every summer in our absence. But it was the newer carvings inside the clubhouse's walls that made me truly start questioning what sort of forces I'd reawakened by returning to this accursed slice of the Black Forest etched into the aged wood planks, mixed in with Papa's and my initials dating back to the 90s, were an unsettling array of far more recently carved messages. Jagged runes and cryptic symbols beside phrases scrawled with an almost feverish urgency like May 2022. They send scouts every spring, and the forest heard you laughing last week. Now it knows I'm here. The most recent etching, however, cut deep into the beam across from the entrance ladder, seemed to be addressed directly at me or whoever might rediscover the treehouse after lying abandoned for decades. June 2023. You think you know this place, but you've only seen one shadow of its face. Get back down that trail and don't come back here until the solstice passes. My friends, I wish I could describe the unholiness that seemed to freeze my blood in that squalid treehouse diorama at that exact moment. It felt like an ominous presence had materialized behind me without a sound, a sentient malice distilled into its most primal essence. A grotesque, vine-like appendage had wound its way up from the forest floor to pluck me out of my childhood sanctuary. I barely remember the mad, panicked flight I made back towards the trail that day, thorns and branches lacerating my face and arms as that presence from the black forest seemed to give chase. I sprinted sightlessly for what felt like an eternity before finally collapsing into a fetal position on the muddy path, gulping for air between hollow sobs and glazed with a cold sweat. Once I felt somewhat tethered to reality again, I got my bearings and hustled back towards the homestead. Packed all my belongings without lingering once before throwing myself back into the truck and getting the hell out of that haunted holler for good. You couldn't pay me enough money to reveal exactly where in the backcountry wilderness region of Pennsylvania that damned treehouse lies, for I'll never guide another living soul to its accursed threshold. Something deeply ancient and malign still endures within the lightless abysses of the Black Forest, my friends. An entity, or perhaps even a sentient will, dispersed through the very loam and foliage itself, biding its time as the seasons cycle without end, waiting to entrap the next ill-fated wanderer hapless enough to wander too far off humanity's domesticated trail. My grandfather knew the truth all those years ago, and now I understand why he clung to those old-world superstitions about the woods so fiercely. A few months ago, I decided to push my limits by exploring the deepest, least known parts of the Smoky Mountains. I had found some old trail data hinting at a hidden valley that might contain remnants from prehistoric times. The idea of uncovering something ancient and forgotten was too tempting to resist. My journey began with high spirits and a fully packed rucksack. The first day was tough but manageable. The trail, though faint, guided me through dense woods and over small streams. But as I delved deeper into the uncharted territory, the path became almost non-existent. The dense thickets of thorns and steep ravines turned every step into a struggle. For 2 grueling days, I hacked my way through the undergrowth and climbed over rocky terrain, moving at a snail's pace. Just when I was about to give up, I stumbled into a surreal woodland hollow. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. The area was a natural amphitheater, gently sloping and carpeted with ferns. Towering oak and hickory trees encircled the hollow, their trunks draped in pale green lichen that hung like old beards. The place felt ancient, almost sacred. The air was thick with the scent of earth and leaves, and the atmosphere thrummed with a primordial energy. It felt as if the very soil was alive, resonating with the cycle of life and death. At the heart of this secluded grove was a ring of massive, moss-covered boulders, each standing 7 or 8 feet tall. They were arranged in a perfect circle about 30 yards across. The boulders were covered in intricate carvings and symbols, too detailed and deliberate to be the work of natural forces. I saw spirals, celestial bodies, and human-like figures, suggesting this place was used for observing the stars or performing rituals. As an amateur anthropologist, I was thrilled. This was a significant find, possibly an ancient observatory or ceremonial site. I spent hours documenting and sketching the carvings, feeling like I had uncovered a piece of lost history. The carvings hinted at a connection to the region's indigenous cultures, possibly dating back to the woodland period or early Mississippian inhabitants, nearly 1,000 years ago. It was incredible to think that this place might have been used to track the stars and perform sacred rituals. As the day turned to evening, I set up camp nearby, still buzzing with excitement. I couldn't wait to share my discovery with the world. But as dusk fell, the atmosphere in the hollow began to change. The air grew heavy, and an eerie energy seemed to fill the space. There was a metallic tang in the air, like the smell after a lightning strike. It felt like ancient forces were waking up around me. That's when I saw them, figures moving between the trees, emerging from the shadows. They walked slowly towards the stone circle, their forms barely distinguishable from the darkening forest. About a dozen robed figures appeared, blending into the surroundings as they moved. They formed a circle around the stones, and one of them stepped forward, holding a staff decorated with bones and feathers. The figure raised the staff, and a strange, dry sound filled the air. The others joined in, producing an assortment of ritual items, gnarled staffs, bone totems, and hollow drums. The noise grew louder, a chilling, otherworldly sound that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. The air around the stones began to flicker with green sparks, as if something unnatural was trying to break through into our world. Suddenly, in perfect unison, they turned to face me. Their eyes were dark pits, and their mouths opened, releasing a foul mist that withered the plants around them. The noise grew unbearable, drilling into my mind and making me feel like I was being taken over by some ancient force. I realized I had stumbled into something far beyond human understanding. A deep, ancient intelligence communicated with me, making it clear I had trespassed on sacred ground. Terrified, I knew I had to escape before I was consumed by whatever was awakening in that hollow. With great effort, I fled into the forest, running blindly through the darkness. My body and mind felt like they were falling apart. I stumbled through the dense undergrowth, driven by a primal instinct to survive. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to find my way out of the thorn maze and headed towards civilization. It took me 3 more nights to find a highway, where a park ranger finally found me. I was in such bad shape that the paramedics thought I had been attacked by a bear or a cult. My body was covered in strange burns, as if I had been struck by lightning. No one believed my story about hooded figures and cosmic horrors until a rescue team visited the site. They found the ancient observatory exactly as I had described. The evidence they collected showed strange radiation and heat patterns that defied explanation. The boulders seemed to interact with electromagnetic waves in unusual ways. The forest area was quickly cordoned off, and the official reports downplayed the findings. But I know the ancient force I encountered left a mark on me. My sanity is fragile, and I try to forget the layers of reality I saw in that ancient ritual site. 13 years ago, me and my crew of seasoned urban explorers were dead set on documenting this abandoned mining town deep in the backwoods of Hollow Grove Forest out in eastern Kentucky. I'm talking real hillbilly territory, gnarly old oak and hickory trees everywhere, creepy hollows, and caves scattered all over the place. Back in the day, like a century ago, people used to mine coal like crazy around those parts. Whole towns popped up with folks living that rough mining life, you know? This particular ghost town had been on our bucket list for years because, supposedly, it was one of the last fully intact spots left from that late 1800s mining boom. Word was, the place got abandoned in a hurry around 1900, with homes, businesses, churches, the whole 9 yards, just left to rot in the mountains. But here's where it gets truly messed up. This town was wrapped up in all kinds of local legends about some unnatural, messed up creature preying on the citizens, dragging them into the woods. Entire families just vanishing without a trace, leaving behind bloody scraps. They called it the Hollow Grove Horror. Now, we were a bunch of adrenaline junkies who didn't buy into that kind of BS. An old local at the gas station tried to warn us, talking all creepy about the sins of our ancestors and telling us to steer clear of the grove, but we just laughed it off as backwoods hillbilly tales. Man, were we wrong? We had no clue our little adventure that spring day was about to send us straight into the heart of the horror we'd been mocking. As we're trekking deeper into the dark, trailless forest, it started feeling like the trees were closing in behind us, you know? The path kept twisting and turning until finally, we reached the ruins of this haunted ass town. I'll never forget that sight. Crumbling houses with empty windows staring at us like ghostly eyes, collapsed mining shafts all over, just giving off an insanely eerie vibe. As the photographers and drone guys start doing their thing, I'm looking around and noticing some seriously disturbing details. There's no wildlife at all. No birds, no bugs, nothing except dead silence except for our gear and people stumbling through the brush. Then I find these shredded backpacks and personal items scattered around like they'd been thrown with crazy force. Old blood-stained clothes too. But here's what really got under my skin. There was this message scrawled in crusted lettering on the side of this dried-up well. I scraped away decades of grime to reveal the chilling words. Everything that crawls this grove feeds. A chill shot down my spine. Swear I felt like we were being watched at that moment. That's when I noticed these weird, insect-like carvings covering almost every house and window frame, depicting these ropey-limbed creatures with serrated claws. I called out to the others, snapping them out of their exploration days. You could feel this heavy silence fall as we all realized maybe we stumbled onto something ancient and seriously dangerous. Our excitement turned to straight-up fear as we kept finding more and more disturbing signs. Shallow graves dug haphazardly, the earth still fresh like they'd been used recently. Grotesquely twisted crypts seemed to burst from the ground, tangled in gnarled tree roots that coiled around them like skeletal hands. And then there were the carvings, covering nearly every surface, loads more of them now, showing these horrific, messed up sacrificial rituals in vivid detail. Figures with slit throats and hollowed-out rib cages, their organs spilling onto crude altars. Others bound and contorted into human sacrifices to whatever depraved deities this place worshipped. As evening started rolling in, an oppressive heaviness fell over the forest. The shadows between the trees seemed to take on lives of their own, pulsing and undulating like they were breathing. The whole forest felt disconcertingly alive, every creak of wood and whisper of wind setting my nerves even more on edge, you know? Strange, indistinct figures flickered at the edges of my vision, just flashes of movement that disappeared as soon as I tried to focus on them. The wind picked up, letting out these low, droning moans that sounded unsettlingly like muffled, whispering breaths carried on the air currents. The deeper we went into this nightmare realm, the more our group started to get separated and picked off one by one. At first, it would just be a scream piercing that dead, unnatural silence, echoing through the trees. Then this guttural, inhuman roar would answer it, seeming to come from multiple directions all around us, disorienting and trapping us in the middle. We'd spin wildly, cameras raised as the figures emerged from the tree lines, shifting, morphing shapes that defied reality. One second they'd appear as human-like silhouettes moving in strange, contorted ways. Then, as soon as you focused on them, they'd mutate into these grotesque, monstrous things, with too many ropey limbs constantly unfurling from their bodies like rotting centipedes. Rows of serrated fangs filled their unhingeable, gaping mouths which unfolded in themselves like flesh abominations. Milky dead eyes rolled wildly in mutated skulls, fixing on us with hunger. I've never seen anything like these creatures against nature in my life, and they shook me to my very core with a deep, primal, evolutionary fear. Those things moved faster than anything I'd ever encountered, closing in between the blinds of our frantic camera flashes and disorienting strobe lights. One by one, I saw my friends get dragged down by these weird elastic limbs, swallowed whole or simply torn apart in a cacophony of screeches and wet, rending noises. By the time dawn broke through the canopy, I had witnessed so many terrifying beings that no words could fully describe them, sights that made horror flicks look mundane in comparison. I've never felt that deep, soul-shaking fear of being in the presence of something that shouldn't exist on this level of reality. My friends were never seen again, and it was chalked up to just a mass hysteria event that caused them to be lost forever. How I'm the lucky bastard that made it out, I'll never know. I just ran, sprinting blindly through those bramble-laced woods, splashing through rivers and crashing through branches, not resting or looking back until I finally broke through onto a rural highway at daybreak, heaving and drenched in sweat. I don't know exactly what inhuman, depraved presence was lurking in the depths of Hollow Grove, but I know one thing for damn sure: I'm never going back to that place again if I can help it. Those local legends weren't just some made-up boogeyman tales to scare children. They were warnings.